Joining me today to discuss the world of sports is Erik Bay. Erik, thanks for joining me again on this weekly meeting.
Hey, no problem. Always a pleasure, and especially with a ton of sports to talk about.
Yeah, and the sports today that we will be talking about is the Arizona Coyotes got handed out. They are fine. They will be losing their 2020 first round pick and their 2020 second round, or rather 2021 second round pick. And this is due to tampering with players before the NHL Combine. Erik, first of all, I just want to get your opinions. Do you think this discipline was enough?
I think so. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're talking about combine and stuff, I guess, yes, they would have tampered a little bit and stretched the rules, but I don't think this is the gravest thing that anyone's ever done. It does hurt, though, just from a team perspective. When you look at the Coyotes, obviously those picks are very important. And for a team that hasn't done so well drafting and developing recently and is still trying to, be a team on the rise, this is really going to hurt them, I think, for the next few years. It's going to be felt.
Yeah, I agree with you, Erik. I mean, the two picks, it hurts Arizona more than it would hurt a lot of teams. And one thing that we have seen from Arizona is that their lack of development in later rounds is really starting to catch up to them and is starting to hurt them. As well, they don't have a general manager right now to really be sorting them through this process, as John Chicka I guess, parted ways with the Arizona Coyotes. This was a big reason for it. But just, Erik, going through their prospect pool, what are your thoughts on it? I mean, it isn't super strong outside of their first-round picks.
Yeah, and that's really been the story for the Arizona Coyotes recently, and especially when you look at John Chayka's tenure, and obviously he hasn't been or wasn't there for very long, 3-4 years, so there's still plenty of time for some of these prospects to kind of develop. But when you look at his kind of draft history, the only players who have seen any action, that is, are only first-round picks in Barrett Hayton, Jacob Chychrun, and Clayton Keller, so guys that you're supposed to be hitting on. And even then, I would say that none of them have really developed, I think, as much as you would have hoped over the last few years. And even going back to before John Chayka's tenure, and you look at some of the prospects that still were developing when his time has come, and really the only ones that are kind of out of the blue or maybe later round picks that you don't really expect are guys like Connor Garland, and that's one guy. And I mean, you look at the Oilers right now and what their problems are with depth. It's the same thing in Arizona, and obviously, again, that's going to be an issue if you can't develop those later guys. How are you going to continue to make your team better and become a contender? And then again, as we've mentioned before, losing those two picks, that's really going to hurt that development and the future.
Yeah, Garland, as you mentioned, was a fifth-round pick, 123rd overall in the 2015 draft when Chicka was a assistant general manager rather than the general manager. Now, his big philosophy was all about stats and that side of the game. Erik, do you think that this test with John Chicka, do you think it was a success, or do you think it went down the drain?
Well, you tell me. Arizona was what, 11th overall in the Western Conference this year, hadn't made the playoffs in his tenure, and we've talked about the drafting. So I would say it was a pretty big failure on that point. And you look at some of the other, young GMs around the league who are supposed to be these stat heads, and Kyle Dubas was also kind of the poster child for this movement. And you look at what Toronto's doing. Yes, they do have some good stars, but it hasn't gotten them out of the first round. So again, I think you can use those fancy stats to a point, and obviously it's the core season, the Fenwicks, what we're talking about. But again, I think with hockey too, more so than something like baseball, which is very stat heavy, you still have to pass the eye test, and there's a ton of things you can't measure. And for me as well, it's kind of a chicken and egg scenario. At what point does Corsi determine if you have a good team, or is it because you have a good team that you have a good Corsi, and vice versa? So again, I think this kind of maybe not proves it, but shows that you can't just rely on stats alone, and you still do need some more of that front office and past experience running teams and scouting talent.
For sure, Chicka was the youngest GM hired in all of professional sports in North America at the time of his hirement, and it seemed like he tried to play Moneyball, but with players that cost too much money. He had over 6 players getting paid over $5 million this past season, and when you're not developing players, like we've mentioned through the draft, that's just too much to be paying a whole lineup worth of guys, especially when you're trying to go for that depth. Another place that they have they didn't develop well was specifically the 2017 draft. Out of the players that they drafted in that season, only one of them being Tyler Steenbergen, who was on the Canadian World Junior Gold Medal team. He was the only one still on the team. Other players who were drafted and are no longer with the Coyotes organization include Nolan Hoffermeyer, who just won the CHL's Defenseman of the Year, Mackenzie Entwistle, who's a two-time OHL champion, and Pierre-Olivier Joseph, who was their first round pick that they traded away. So they haven't been able to develop those guys to really fill in those spots when you can't pay that much money. Now, Erik, how do you think this will affect Arizona just quickly here in the future?
Yeah, again, I think we're going to see this, and then obviously you look at the losing picks. I think it's going to be tough. And you mentioned too about spending money. They also hamstrung themselves by taking on contracts like Chris Pronger and Pavel Datsyuk. So again, I think we're going to see a little bit more short-term pain in the state of Arizona for the next few years, I would say.
Well, Erik, it's always a pleasure getting to chat with you, especially when it is about hockey. Thanks for taking this time.
For sure.